Vice Chairman Rajaratnam,
Here.
Commissioner Yates,
Here.
Commissioner Ferris,
Here.
and we have 2 absent, but 3 present. We have a quorum.
Can you please all rise for the pledge? Mr. Skip Gorman, can you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, sir. Approval of agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I so move.
I will second.
Acting Chairman Rajaratnam,
Aye.
Commissioner Yates,
Aye.
Commissioner Ferris,
Aye.
3 ayes, motion carries.
Approval of minutes of April 24th, 2018.
So move.
Second.
Acting Chairman Rajaratnam,
Aye.
Commissioner Yates,
Aye.
Commissioner Ferris,
Aye.
3 ayes, motion carries.
Public comments of items not on the agenda. Persons wishing to address the Commission on matters that are within the Commissioner's jurisdiction and do not already appear on the agenda may do so at this time. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the Planning Commission may not take action on an item that does not appear on this agenda. Speakers are limited to 5 minutes. The public comment section of the agenda is limited to a total of 1 hour. Each speaker is asked to provide his or her name. I'll give a few seconds. I don't see anybody rushing to the podium, so we'll close public comment at this time at 6:04 city's time. Public hearing, there is nothing. Next item is discussion and other action items. Should I read this? Staff report, please.
On our agenda is extension of tentative tract map 6869. That would be a 159-lot single-family subdivision on 42.7 gross acres located at the intersection of Dolphin Ave and Sunland Street. This was first approved in August 2006. It was part of a package of entitlements which included the rezoning and general plan amendment to accommodate this project, a parcel map which reconfigured the parent parcels for the benefit of this tentative tract map, and an accompanying tentative tract map for 123 condominiums on a narrow strip immediately to its north. All 4 of these applications were approved on that date of August 8, 2006, and through acts of the state legislature, they have been kept alive until August 8th of this year. And the applicant is now seeking a 1-year extension in accordance with our subdivision code. This is as I said before, a 159-lot single-family subdivision, zoned R1, general plan, designation of residential low, and that would be a minimum 6,000 square foot lot size. The smallest lots in this subdivision are just exceeding that minimum. The largest are just over double that size. It's located, as I said, at the intersection of Dolphin and Sunland, and it stretches all the way to the intersection of Gemstone, reaching about just 400 feet south of Baton Avenue, which is, that would be the boundary of this tract and tract 6870. The primary access is going to be through a new east to west road that roughly bisects the subdivision and meanders through it. And then there'll be 4 additional local roads providing access to the north and south, as well as half dozen cul-de-sacs. With the exception of Dolphin Ave, there's really no fully improved streets in the area of the subdivision. Sunland Street is graded, and appears to be a full-width street and is graded somewhat smooth, but gemstone and baton in this area are rather primitive as of today. So the original approval called for numerous public improvements to all these streets, specifically for half-width pavement on Sunland Street from Dolphin to Bowman, 6-foot masonry walls be constructed all around the frontage of Dolphin and Sunland, as well as the normal requisite utility connections. The site is generally flat and drains largely to the north. It should be noted that the sump park for this project was originally incorporated into Track 6870, and therefore you will not find one on this map. I did speak to Daryl Witten of Cornerstone Engineering because this Track 6870, as I mentioned earlier, is also expiring in August of this year, and we had not received an extension application for that one. Mr. Witten informs me that the owners are considering a change in configuration of 6870 that would provide detention enough for that track's stormwater, but not serve this subdivision. And he said that the engineering work can be done, if necessary, to sacrifice a few of the residential lots within 6869 to accommodate the master drainage plan detention facilities. So overall, this tract substantially conforms to all the applicable zoning and general plan requirements, and compared to some of the other tracts we've seen recently, the improvements are relatively modest, at least when viewed in comparison to the size of the tract overall. It would also provide a more immediate or medium-term solution to our dire need for housing, especially at a time where staffing levels at Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake are beginning to spur increased demand. With regards to the environmental review, a mitigated negative declaration was adopted back in August 2006, and the mitigation measures included compliance with all of our Planning Commission conditions, as well as whichever measures the California and U.S. Departments of Fish and Wildlife had stipulated. As there's no changes to the project that's before us now when compared to the last time we've seen it, all of that environmental review that was done previously remains valid, and therefore staff recommends that the attached draft resolution be approved, which would extend this tentative tract map through August 8th, 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Commissioner comments?
If this tract map is approved without the sump or the pocket park, is that going to be an issue later?
As I said, and also this was included in the staff report, and I alluded to it, but I didn't quite directly state it just now. It's important to see when 6870 comes in that they're either dealing with all of the detention from both sites, or that they're at least dealing with their own, and that's the minimum that Mr. Witten says is likely. Per our resolution, they are required to detain it, but it's not going to be shown on the plan. It would need to be engineered to accommodate that, and so you would see a few of the buildable, sellable lots being sacrificed essentially for drainage. And That is a condition that already exists. Since it's not a new condition, we might want to rephrase it to emphasize that, but that is something that the Planning Commission back in 2006 had the sense to address.
Thank you.
Mr. Yates.
What resolution is this? 18 what?
Believe it would be 1810. We haven't been numbering them because it's. I was under the impression that that was something that would be assigned once the resolution was adopted, and that this was, just a placeholder designation.
I have a question for City Engineer, Mr. Culp. Does the sump requirement fall under your purview? And what are your comments? What are your recommendations on that?
No, the sump condition would not affect the recordation of the final map. The recordation of the final map requires me to sign the map indicating that it is in substantial conformance or compliance to the tentative map. If they did, it's okay to reduce the number of lots and still say it's in substantial conformance, but it would not be okay if they were to increase the number of lots. In which case I would not be able to certify that it is in substantial compliance with the tentative map. So it would not interfere with them to record the map.
So it would not, so we don't need to put a condition, is that what you're saying?
That is correct. The sump lots, if they so do provide them on the site, would not affect our ability to record the map. It is not going to affect it whatsoever.
Thank you. So, Mr. Bruno, so do you think we should put any condition that they should, what is your recommendation?
Well, we cannot create new conditions out of whole cloth when we're simply considering an extension. We can, if the substance of the condition is the same, I feel we'd be on solid ground rephrasing it to emphasize that if 6870 is reconfigured to not incorporate drainage for this site as well, or not to provide capacity, then that it should be provided within the tract. Also, in situations where we have where the applicant agrees with the condition, we can add a new condition if it's mutually agreed. And like I said, from my conversation with Mr. Witten, it doesn't seem like that's going to be a point of contention.
So we can have a condition like that?
He's saying we can, but it's probably not necessary.
Yeah, I'm saying essentially it's addressed by a condition. We can probably put a finer point on it just so that it's totally unambiguous. But if we want to make the requirement more stringent, then that would need to be a formal agreement between us and the applicant.
We just want to make sure that if we vote to extend this tentative track map, that the sump is still going to be addressed.
Correct.
I believe that's what we want to make sure. And it sounds like from what the city engineer and as well as what yourself is saying, is that it will be addressed in 6870.
Yeah, well, that's what the plan is presently. Like I said, the owner of the property is in talks with Cornerstone to, rather than renewing the site, rather than renewing the tract map for 6870 to reconfigure it as a condominium or apartment site plan, and that the drainage might be scaled back. If that's the case, he said they would provide the drainage by deducting lots from 6869. And I will point you to, in our draft resolution, item 14F. That's the condition to which I'm referring that I believe covers that base. If we want to, like I said, put a finer point on it, I think that we would be on solid ground to do that, but we can't make the requirement any more onerous or any more intensive than it was originally.
Thank you, sir. This time I open it up for public comments on this item.
Yes, Dave Matthews. Is this on? Hello? Yeah. Dave Matthews.
Yeah.
My address is on file with the city clerk. First of all, to you commissioners that are present, would you please speak into the microphone? I don't know about people in the back. Even up front here, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Now, I got a problem too, I know, but please. I would not rely on word alone. I would put something in the resolution that the drainage issue would be addressed when the other tracks come forward. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment? Okay, I don't see anybody, so I'll close public comment at this time. So, do we have a motion to approve with a condition or without condition?
So who are you asking? Who you're what was the question?
Do I have a motion?
You're asking them.
Yeah, I think that it needs that extra language in there, just so it's crystal clear. So I would say we move forward with the resolution as long as that's stipulated.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I so move. A second, sorry.
Acting Chairman Ron Rodman,
Aye.
Commissioner Yates,
Aye.
Commissioner Ferris,
Aye.
3 ayes, motion carries.
Thank you. Next item is proposed cargo containers ordinance. Staff report, please.
Okay, this item is being introduced in response to numerous residential complaints we received in recent weeks and months, specifically on the subject of cargo containers, sea trains. They have many names. They'll be immediately recognizable to all of us. They're typically 40 by 8.5 foot by 8.5 foot corrugated metal intermodal container used for freight purposes, and a lot of people have taken to using them as storage on land on their property. And we believe that we can strike a balance that provides some standard for the benefit of people who want to live in a neighborhood that looks like a residential neighborhood, while also not restricting it so tightly that we're completely shutting off a relatively inexpensive option for storage. And so, with that in mind, we've drafted the following proposals. First is to define cargo containers. It's nowhere mentioned in the city code one way or the other. There's no restriction, special permission, definition. And so, first step really is to provide some definition for this. To further that point, we need to also distinguish a cargo container from an accessory building. Right now, really the only way we can govern them at all is to apply the accessory building standards, and they don't quite fit especially because, you know, when you have something like a shed or a workshop or garage, that usually doesn't draw the ire of neighbors quite as much as the cargo containers seem to do. So we do want to make that distinction as a baseline, and then permit them very broadly in the CS and CG's commercial, general commercial and service commercial zones, provided they meet the setbacks for the zone in which they're located, and that they're secured with an engineered tie-down system or auger-type anchors, painted, essentially properly anchored, and given the appearance that they're maintained. We don't plan on introducing really any restriction in the industrial zones, because they feel that a cargo container is very much in keeping with an industrial use. Neighborhood commercial, you typically have lots that are a bit smaller, and they're almost always in closer proximity to residential uses. So we're proposing to allow them at a density not to exceed 140 by 8.5 foot container, or equivalent combination of smaller containers for every 2 acres of site area, and a 20-foot setback all around, 10-foot setback from the primary structure, and anchoring, again, as we previously suggested. Additional containers can be considered, but we would recommend that that be a conditional use permit if they're looking to put several on a relatively small property. Then that's something that really it seems appropriate to bring before the Planning Commission and have the neighborhood have some chance to have it heard. With that in mind, we also feel that professional office zone, again, the lots are smaller still, and again, it's in very close proximity to residences, so that also should be a conditional use permit, and we should have a 20-foot setback, all sides, 10-foot from the primary structure. It should be screened and anchored, and generally kept in a well-maintained appearance. With the and same goes for residential zones. We do think that some exception or some a little bit more latitude should be granted for temporary storage, provided that they, the homeowner, the property owner, get a temporary storage permit. That way we can establish how long they've been there, that they're properly located, meeting the setbacks for that zone, and that they should be placed on a level concrete or asphalt surface. We feel that in the case of residential zones, it should be required that the homeowner have a damage repair or construction permit that had been recently issued. We're recommending within the past 30 days of applying for the temporary storage permit, which they can get for up to a 90-day interval, and at the discretion of the community development manager, that can be extended to up to 1 year total. So we also want to stipulate minimum requirements for anchoring. The ones that we've chosen here to recommend are exactly the ones that have been applied in Kern County for about 20 years. And for any CUP application for a cargo container, we feel that either a plot plan or a survey of the property that is recent enough to accurately reflect existing conditions, which has been marked up accurately to scale to show where the containers are to be located. That way we can essentially keep the property owner honest, make sure that they're complying, and that we have something in writing to hold them to. We're going to also make the recommendation that utility connections to cargo containers be prohibited. I understand there's some concerns about cultivation of marijuana and other potentially less than desirable activities that could be easily concealed in a cargo container if you had utility service to it. And in general, we feel that they should be, rather than peeling paint or the fading livery from whichever shipping line once owned them, that they should be painted a neutral earthen color and kept clean and generally well maintained in appearance. Now, the one thing I think that will come as some relief to those who already have them is that we recommend giving pretty generous grandfather clause on this, in that if they have a 10-foot setback from the primary structure, if they meet the setback requirements for that zone, if they're not stacking the containers or placing containers greater than 8.5 feet, if they're properly anchored and painted, that they should be allowed to exist. And in this case, we're not even recommending that a formal permit be required to establish this. We feel as long as they meet all the conditions that would be applied on a new container, with the exception of the larger setback and the density requirements that we're looking to introduce, that should probably be considered to constitute a good enough improvement, and we don't want to give people the feeling that we're pulling out the rug from underneath them. You know, if you've had a container for several years, we do ask that you be neighborly, and out of consideration for others, that you try and keep it attractive. You try and keep it from being an obtrusive presence, but that in general, we don't want to put you through any great difficulty. And the merits of this, I think it would be prudent for us to have the commissioners debate the particulars and make their own recommendations.
Thanks for the report, Mr. Bruno.
You're welcome.
Commissioners, do you have any questions to the staff?
Yeah, my question would be, I heard your report, but I'm also wondering how, in my mind, how do you enforce if someone doesn't meet what you're suggesting? How do you enforce it if we don't have it as code?
Well, that's the thing. Staff has drafted a suggested ordinance change. What you're seeing in the staff report is essentially discussing the substance of the changes that we'd recommend. If the commissioners feel that they want to go in a stronger or less stringent direction, or just tweak it around the edges, or whether they want to endorse essentially what we've presented to them, that is all their prerogative, and we are willing to act accordingly. This is a case where we are seeking the advice of the Planning Commission.
I have a question, because it seems to be brought because there was a number of complaints. The adoption of this ordinance, would that suffice? Would that clear up those complaints, or is this something that only meets a very small percentage of those?
Truth be told, in trying to maintain a balance that we don't want people to feel like they're being too restricted, we don't want to feel like we're being tyrannical or overbearing. But we also, on the other hand, want to have some regard for the people who feel that it needs to be a little bit more tightly regulated. So we're trying to walk the middle line. I feel that some people on both sides will be unhappy, but in my mind, that's an indication that you've made a good effort to have a fair compromise. And the particulars of that, as I said, should be up for discussion.
Thank you.
On those lines, I'd request Officer Booth to tell us something about what you are facing, how many violations, what is the response.
Well, the biggest problem I have right now is that there are no violations because it's not mentioned in the municipal code. So I did some research about 2 years ago because I was running into these problems. And I sent out a message to all the code enforcement officers in California. The majority do restrict them from residential zones. Some treat them specifically as an accessory building. But in each case, cargo containers are in their municipal code. So at least there's something to go by. Right now, there's nothing I can go by. I did open a case last month because somebody complained about 2 cargo containers on the lot. I sent him a letter requesting to go to the building department and basically treat it as an accessory building. But I went to see him today, and he said that when he moved, he just bought the place a month ago, and he had all of his household goods in them because he's redoing this house. He said before he moved here, he checked the municipal code to see what restrictions there were on cargo containers. There were none, and he placed them on his property. I personally can't see throwing him a violation for an accessory building because it's not in the code whatsoever. And there's a lot of other people that complain about them. The biggest issue, I think, is the fact that they look like sea containers. You know, they have all the writing, they're ugly, they're rusted usually. We need something in the code to say how to treat these if you're going to have them. And I think that would make a lot of people happy, especially if they're already established on a residential property. You know, we have a new ordinance, we put it out to people saying, hey, if you have one, here's what you have to do. If not, a year from now, you could be cited if you don't meet the requirements. But we give them plenty of time to do that. But in the meantime, those that want a new container, they have to meet these requirements. Right now, we have a place on Ridgecrest Boulevard. It's a commercial establishment. He has a sea container there, but it's not painted. And I don't think it's probably tied down. We need the requirements in order to enforce them. That's the problem we're having right now.
So, did we do research what the other cities in Kern County are doing? Do they have restrictions? Or?
I'm not real sure about Kern County, but here's a list of all the cities in California that I got responses from 2 years ago as to what they're doing.
Okay.
Like I said, the majority of them do not allow them in residential zones. Others treat them as an accessory building. And it just depends on how we want to work it. Every city is different. But the fact that no utilities would probably be a good idea. We had training about a month or two ago at the police department regarding grow rooms. With this size container, you could easily put, say, 48 plants in there. And with a minimum $5,000 investment, they could make almost $500,000 in a year. Something we don't need.
Sure. Is this something that you've seen maybe have shown up this year, just this year?
They're slowly. I've been getting a complaint recently, at least once a month. Last month I got 2 complaints. But if we don't do something soon, we'll end up having an issue like we did on South Sims a few years back.
Thank you, sir. So I'd like you to remain there if you have more questions. So I do have some questions, but I'll reserve those things. I'll open it for public comment at this time.
Good evening, gentlemen. Mike Neal. I have a short list of questions here. I'd like to see if I could get any concrete answers to these particular questions first. What is the best estimate as to the number of these containers in Ridgecrest?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, since they're not any kind of permitting or code related to it, and there is no real violation of the municipal code, I haven't been keeping track.
Okay, since you don't have a number, my number should be considered as good. Years ago, when Mr. Howard was in his long-held conflict with the city, he had C-vans on his property. He was initially told he had to get rid of them. Obviously, he didn't have to get rid of them based on what was said here tonight. So he was curious, so he went around and he counted. And he told me that he counted at least 200 C-van containers in this town. So, barring any other evidence to the contrary, we'll have to go, I'd have to say we have at least 200 here, because we had someone who actually went and did the count, and it was vital to his situation, so I believe it's a number. And you said, let's see, just recently, did you have an average of one complaint a month about these containers? Was that what you said?
That's about what it has been. People complaining about it being there, but there's really nothing I can do, being that it's not specific in the municipal code as far as what to do with a cargo container.
And would you say these are complaints from a different person, 12 different people each year, or are you getting multiple complaints? Usually you'll get a multiple complaint from one particular person.
Well, for example, I had a complaint last month about somebody in College Heights who put one in his driveway, and the people were complaining that it's going to claiming that it's going to ruin their home value if they try and sell.
Okay. I just realized I'm being timed here. Am I only getting 5 minutes?
Sure, yes, sir. 5 minutes.
That's not going to get me through this at all. So let me get selective here. I thought we were having a discussion, not a limited comment. Okay, I'll just make my comments instead of asking these questions here. Okay, one thing that says we want a balance here. Okay, the big problem here, like I said, 200 plus containers in this town. Most of them have been here for a really long time. These people have obviously, there's a value to those property owners in those containers that they wouldn't, they won't have them just because, well, I'd like to have, there's something, cool about having a sea container on my property. They've got all kinds of stuff in there, no doubt. That's what they're there for. There's no rules about what they had to do, so they put them where it best suit their purposes. So you're going to put new rules on them and tell them, probably a lot of them, you're going to have to move that. Well, it's a big deal when you already got fence around your property, and then you got to, it's heavy equipment time to move one of those containers. So you're putting an extreme burden on the people with the containers, and yet maybe 12 or less complaints a year versus 200 containers in town. That seems to me to be a small ratio. You also need to be cognizant of the fact that in the city code, I looked up the city code, and you only cited the definition of accessory building. Just below that, in section 21.2, is the definition of accessory use. And that just simply means a use incidental and subordinate to the principal use established on the same lot. Well, that makes a sea container an accessory building. So you already have a definition for what a sea container is on those lots. It's an accessory building. So there it sits, and it's an accessory building according to how you define it. Now, you need to keep in mind that because of these kind of ambiguities you may potentially allow here, you may put yourself in for a class action lawsuit, because I can easily foresee a lot of property owners getting really upset and then taking the city to court saying, you can't make us do this, and using the argument in court that the city's just simply, by default, allowed this for years and years and years. So you might think a little more carefully about the position you're putting yourself in here, and the city in here, and for what benefit? 12 complaints a year, max, from what I'm hearing. That's really not a lot. And I can almost guarantee you, knowing the nature of various people, and they have a complaint and something didn't happen and they think it ought to, they're going to call you back and 5 minutes later they'll call you back again. And so a lot of these complaints are probably multiple complaints. So I don't see the ratio of problem to what's existing there as really being something to be real concerned about. I mean, most people moved into these locations with the sea containers in place on the properties around them. I'd say there's probably very, very few. And you've been here, that most of them are out in Ridgecrest Heights. They're in the fringe areas. And for people to move in to something that's already existing and then start complaining about it is highly questionable. Like, why are you complaining? You knew this was here, and now you're complaining. And to make a law just because you have a few complaints is not really the proper process for making laws.
Thank you, Mr. Neal.
Yes, Dave Matthews again. Before the meeting, when this agenda came out, I was looking through this item, and I found it rather interesting that nobody can find any mention anywhere of sea containers in any of the city codes or regulations or ordinances. Because I remember distinctly sitting in these chambers either with the Planning Commission or the City Council, I'm not sure which anymore, I think it was probably the Planning Commission, and we discussed sea vans of various sorts at various times. Now, I have no way of remembering when exactly those were, but we did discuss them. I do remember being in this chamber and discussing them. In light of that, I'm curious now as to why Mr. Howard had to get rid of some of his sea containers. I think one of these days maybe I'll go back and revisit some of those proceedings. The other thing is this just residential, or is it going to be residential and commercial?
Both residential and commercial.
Okay, you've only been mentioning residential, but yes, I know there are businesses that use these at various places, and there again, I know of one in particular that actually talked to the city hall about something regarding that container, that it had to be on a pad and so on and so forth, and anchored down and this and that and the other thing, which they have done. Now, the other thing I'd like to remind people about is that the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, among other things, says that Congress, subsequent lawmakers, shall not pass ex post facto laws. So anything that is in position now, you cannot make any changes to their requirements in the future. Period. And I know there's a lot of people or a lot of laws that have done that already. That doesn't make them constitutional or just. So keep that in mind as you go through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
Hi, I'm Skip Gorman, and when I knew Sea Containers was coming up tonight, it got my attention. I've been through the preliminary ordinance provisions, and I don't have trouble with them, except one took me by surprise. In paragraph 5, second sentence, require 20-foot setback from property line on all sides. That surprised me a little bit because I was careful how I had my sea container put in. by George Bertrand's outfit. And by the way, he paints his sea containers very nicely. He brought it in and conducted magic with a truck and a tractor. It was something to see. I wished I could have filmed it. But he set it right down on the cement footing I had provided, and it's bolted down properly as your words will ultimately demand. But in building the cement footing and getting all the advice I could find, the property line setback, to my way of thinking, was 10 feet, not 20. If you could check on that and assure me that it's not capricious, pull out a thin air number, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, so sir, you are correct. It will depend on your zone. In some cases, the side yard setback will be 5 feet. In some, it'll be 10, depending on your zone. And the way that I've drafted this, and I apologize if it's been unclear, but it was meant so that if you have a sea container in a residential district already, then we're not going to make it meet this 20-foot setback. That would be for all ones that come in the future. That way, we're trying to preempt this from being a concern going forward. As I said, we don't have the intention of pulling out the rug from underneath people. But we do ask that if they haven't been painted, if they haven't been anchored, that they do that. And that if it's closer than 10 feet for fire safety purposes to the primary structure, then we would ask to move it. Or if it were right on the property line, those extreme instances, then that would probably be a case where I would suggest that the final ordinance asked it to be moved. But if you're meeting the setback for your zone that was in place at the time when there was no distinction made between a sea container and a shed or garage or workshop, then don't feel that that should be something that you should be forced to change, provided that you maintain it and you anchor it for safety and aesthetic purposes. And that's how it's meant to read.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your sensitivity on that.
Mr. Gorman, if you look at item 11, permit existing cargo containers to remain, so it does not stipulate the 20 feet.
I noticed that.
Oh.
In fact, I smiled. It lit up the whole room. Another thought occurred to me while I was sitting back there, too. You know, sea containers may have twinkled into existence during our lifetimes. I'll have to research this. I don't know how old those puppies are. Anyway, where I live is on 10 acres up on Bowman Road in a balkanized little island of the city directly south of the fairgrounds. I don't even know what our zoning is. Hokey smokes. I felt like we could have chickens for a while. We don't anymore. Okay. My friends, thank you. You grabbed a tiger by the tail here. Good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Gorman. Any other public comment? Yeah. So, Mr. Bruno, I have a couple of questions. So, when you amended the definition, what did you add there? Is it the word excluding cargo containers that was added?
With regards to the amended definition of accessory building, yes, that's the only difference between the definition as it exists now and the one that's proposed. And then proceeding in item 1, we have the definition that we've suggested for cargo containers. Again, the particulars of this, we're not trying to dictate them. This is meant to be a starting point for the discussion. If you feel it's sound, then you certainly have every right to endorse it. If you feel that it needs to be reconsidered, then we look at it item for item and we consider the merits of each.
Yeah, I like the idea. I mean, I'm not disputing that. But I think we should tweak it a little bit to make things very clear. like we should say sea containers to be used for storage purpose only, something like that, so that they don't misuse the sea containers. And we didn't stipulate that anywhere here. That's what I noticed.
I did attempt to address it in that they were each area. You'll notice point 3, 4, 5 that we're specifically permitting them for permanent storage, and then in item 6 for temporary storage. The reason why that's not included in the definition is the definition is just to tell you what they are, and then elsewhere in the code we're supposed to outline what can be done with them. That's you know, of course you'll see some variation on how it's treated depending on who's drafting the code, but that's pretty typical that the definition won't be an exhaustive list of uses.
Sure, I understand. And the size you mentioned 40 feet by 8.5 foot container. So 8.5 is width or height?
It's actually both in the vast majority of the cases. They do have some higher ones. This is the most common size, which is why it's the one that I cite most frequently. There are some that are, I believe, 12.5 feet high, and then you'll see containers that are half length, like 20 feet. This tends to be the most common, and so that's kind of the metric that we're using here.
So if somebody wants to have a 40 feet by 8.5, so then they're allowed as per this definition?
Where you see it's defining the permitted density, say in the one that we've suggested for the CN zone as 1 40 by 8.5 foot container per 2 acres of site area. That is, yeah, that would be exactly what we're permitting, and I tried to word it to express that if you had 2 20 by 8.5 by 8.5 containers, that's also permissible. We're not trying to precisely dictate that's just a good rule of thumb, a good maximum that we thought would be appropriate to lay down.
Yeah, I think the standard site, Mr. Bruno, is 40 by 8 by 8.5. I think you may want to double check on that.
That certainly could be done.
So, and do we require them to fence, so that they are not visible, so something like that? If you want to, I'm just throwing out ideas.
In residential zones, we feel that's appropriate. Commercial zones, not so much, as long as they're not encroaching. And we said that as long as they meet the setback for that zone, the same setback that would be applied for any outbuilding or any kind of structure on the property, then we don't see much of a problem. Residential, that's where you get most of the complaints about. You see words like eyesore people will allege that it's harming their property values. That's not so much the issue in commercial zones. So we did not prescribe that requirement in there.
Right, thank you. So, Commissioners, any other comments? I would suggest, we will do some more research on that and bring it back for the next meeting.
Yeah, it was just on the agenda for discussion anyway, so.
Right, so that's what we will do. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Officer Booth. Appreciate it. Next item on the agenda, Commissioner's comments. Both report and comments combined together.
Quality of life has not met recently, but will next month, maybe. And then I will let Penn discuss economic development. So.
Yes, Ms. Pradeep.
Are you going to skip Mr. Yates?
Okay, Mr. Yates.
Well, in lieu of what she's going to discuss, I don't want to steal any of her thunder, but it was, personally for me, it was a very very good experience to go to the, I'm going to say this right, ISCS? Yeah, the conference in Las Vegas. It's very interesting to see all the work that goes into getting a restaurant or hotel or any kind of business here. It made me have a totally different perspective and a respect for what those that do that work to get, say, like a Marshall's here or whatever. And it really helps me just working with the city, because people, they really don't know what you do. They just know you're on some kind of planning something or another. So I get approached all the time about why don't we have this and why don't we have that. So I can better answer those questions now.
Correct.
So I just want to say thanks to the city for allowing me to attend that conference.
Great.
Very good.
Ms. Pan-Pradesh.
I'd like to thank my chaperones, Mr. Ferris Jr., also known as Mr. Jr. at the Westgate Resort, and Mr. Yates for attending the show with me. We had a great time. A lot of walking, in which Cecil the Diesel beat us every day with his steps. But we had a lot of promising leads with hotels and restaurants and businesses. I just gave you a nickname.
Off the record.
But we had a great time, and it can sometimes get very frustrating not getting what we want right away, but I think we're going to move ahead. We're moving along and making some progress.
Thank you, ma'am.
So there's always next year. Mr. Jr., Mr. Yates.
I was at the city org meeting. I mean, Mr. Yates was also there. And we discussed about city cleanup, and Gary Charlan was there. And he made a comment that there are so many empty buildings which need to be refurbished, and so that's the direction they are going in the cleanup process. So we'll further have some more discussion on that and have somebody take care of the Ridge project or some kind of project like that. So that's what has come up from the city org meeting. Staff items, please. Any staff items?
We have sent out the initial study for Red Rock Villas, so we're waiting for the comment period to end, and then we will bring that back as soon as that comment period is over. And so hopefully we'll be breaking ground before the end of the year, hopefully.
Thank you. Any other staff reports, staff items?
We should also be expecting the RCA church has made application for church auditorium. As it turns out, they did need to go through CEQA review. We need an initial study and prepare a negative or mitigated negative declaration. Other than that, there's not too much stopping it from being heard, and so we just need to have those documents prepared and give them the proper noticing period to allow anyone who might be concerned to examine and question the findings, and then the application could be heard. Other than that, I think that about covers it.
Thank you. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, I might be able to report a few things on projects.
Please.
So desire. We recently got our E76, which is our permission to start our construction for our Sunland Street project. That's between Bowman and Dolphin, which also, by the way, is adjacent to the tentative map that you approved tonight, or the extension of the tentative map. We are going to be out for advertisement for bids this next month. I think our first advertisement goes out on I believe it's on the 14th. The 14th. We're scheduled to open bids in early July. Construction is scheduled to start around the 1st of August and complete around the 1st of September. So we've got our first, this project, by the way, is a CMAQ project. It's a construction, it's a congestion mitigation air quality project that's funded by the federal government with some matching funding by the city. So we've got our first construction project that's going to be launched here very soon. We've also got our crosswalk. These are highway safety improvement projects that are crosswalks at our schools, as well as the Bowman stop intersection. We just got the environmental clearance from Caltrans, our NEPA documents. We're about 90% complete on the design on that, so we should be ready to roll on that here before the end of the year. So, those are just the projects that just come to mind here lately as to what their status is at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Call. So any final comments, Commissioners? Nothing. So I'll adjourn the meeting at 7:03 City time. Thank you all for being here. Have a nice evening.